Welcome to More Than Miles, the podcast where we use storytelling and expert interviews to widen the lens on what it means to be a happy and healthy endurance athlete. We believe that athletes are so much more than their body, sport, and training miles. I'm Dr. Kate Mihevik-Edwards.
And I'm Dr. Kacy Sinders. We are endurance athletes, physical therapists, and huge coffee addicts. We spend most of our time treating, educating, and working with endurance athletes. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Now let's get to the show.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to More Than Miles. Today, we're very excited to have Kayla Balcom, actually Dr. Kayla Balcom, on the show with us. Kayla and Kacy and I have been working a lot together lately, and it's been really fun. So thanks for coming.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Kayla. You are much more dressed for the occasion than Kate and I right now. No one can see this is a podcast, but I think everyone should know how good you look right now.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, you really do.
Don't understand that the bottom half is like sweatpants. No, I'm just kidding.
Even if it was, we wouldn't judge because we get it. And we're on Zoom. And also you recently had a little boy. So I can't, like, the fact you're up and functioning.
I did. I could do a whole podcast about just him. He's the cutest little thing ever. But no, he's adorable. So love him.
How old is he now? How many months?
6 months on Sunday.
Oh my God, it's already been 6 months.
I know. So it's not nearly as impressive that I'm up and moving anymore. Yeah. It's already been 6 months.
I don't know. I think I have an 8-year-old and it's impressive that I'm up and moving. So 6 months is really great.
There we go.
You guys, I have a dog, so it's also impressive. No, I'm just kidding.
No, it is. It is. Okay, so we're just going to jump in now. We have been lucky enough recently to add you to our team of medical practitioners and coaches that work with the Atlanta Track Club Elite. For the people on the podcast that don't know, we have a weekly meeting on Wednesdays where we kind of talk and meet together and really do our best to kind of help drive this team forward. And I had been asking for a long time for a sports psychologist to join the team, and everybody knew we needed one. And everyone agreed, but nobody knew who to add and ask. And I was introduced to Kayla. And so we were really excited when she decided to join us. You work with runners with us, Kayla, but I know that you work with a lot of different athletes. You work with regular people, and you grew up as a figure skater, right?
I did.
So tell us a little bit about that and kind of that background.
Yeah. So I grew up as a figure skater out in Idaho. There's not a whole lot to do there. So winter sports are very popular and common. So I grew up as a figure skater. I did that since, I was probably 3 years old the first time my mom put me on the ice. And that was simply because she was a coach at the time. And it was easier to just have her kids on the ice with her than find a babysitter. So that's how I started. And then I did that all the way through college. And that was really my introduction to sports psychology. A lot of the much better figure skaters than I were using sports psychologists even way back then, and found it incredibly helpful. And that was also my first introduction, unfortunately, to some really dangerous and unhealthy behaviors that we see in a lot of our athletes. And so I kind of got the full spectrum of the healthy stuff, the unhealthy stuff, the pressure to perform, the competitive drive, all of the above. And then when I got to college, it became more just for fun. And then I eventually separated myself from that and started pursuing other things. But that was my identity for a really, really long time, probably from the ages of 3 to 20, 21 years old.
Wow. When you start something so young and your mom is a coach and it's interwoven into everything that you do, it can easily become part of your identity and who you are. Yeah. How do you reconcile that? And how do you realize that you are not your sport?
Yeah. Well, did I do such a great job? I'm in sports psychology as a profession. So, I distanced myself, but just enough where I'm still heavily involved in athletics. I think I knew at a young enough age that it really wasn't going anywhere in terms of professional pursuits, competitive pursuits. I wasn't going to be making it to the Olympics. I wasn't going to be making it to a nationals or a worlds. There was a very good chance that I was going to be a performer as a figure skater. So I was getting ready to do the Disney on Ice circuit and do the whole kind of travel the country and perform. But I also come from, they would lovingly say this about themselves, so I don't feel so bad, but I also come from parents who are educational snobs. So they were not ready for me to give up college in pursuit of a nomadic lifestyle. So college was first. If I still wanted to skate after that, I could. And I just kind of realized along the way, this is a love of mine. It's a passion of mine. It's a big part of who I am, but it's also not going to take me anywhere beyond just really enjoying it. So I transitioned into sports psychology, and here I am still in the world of athletics.
Yeah, so can we talk a little bit about how you got into psychology and how much sort of your background and maybe your own experiences with mental health and sports psychology and things like that have influenced the direction that you eventually took with your career?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was lucky enough to have a psychology class in high school. That sounds strange because I actually think a lot of high schools offer psychology, but where I grew up, it was a very rural community, very small community. That was actually a one of a kind, unique class to take in high school. So I was lucky enough to take that in high school, fell in love with it, knew that I was really interested in that area, and then had a number of peers who were seeing a sports psychologist as figure skaters. And so was introduced to it in that way as well. My coach would bring someone in to speak to us about imagery and visualization and self-talk and all the things that I promote to my athletes too. But as a 7, 8, 9-year-old kid, I was like, I don't know what any of this means. This is all very complex and confusing. So I was introduced to it pretty young, and then left for college. Knew right away I was going to be a psych major. Initially was going to be a criminal psychologist. I was planning on going into the CIA and traveling the world and being super nomadic and secretive. And there was just something really glamorous about that lifestyle in my mind. My parents are very pleased that I did not pursue that. And the reason was I took a course in college that was held at a women's prison. It was 50% inmates, 50% college students. And we were just talking about systemic injustices and biases and, how do you introduce yourself to people and the different paths that people, it was a wonderful class. But in that class, we got to interview each other. And one of the inmates said to me, I know that this is something you really want to do with your life, but I know your favorite color. I know where you're from. I know when your birthday is. I know where you want to move to. He's like, you share way too much information. You should probably pick a different path. Wow. So I quickly realized, I was like, oh, okay. So maybe working in the prison system isn't for me.
Wow.
And so landed on
wisdom from an inmate. That's amazing.
I know. It was a fantastic class, right? Changed the course of my life. Truly did. It was a fantastic class. Really wonderful experience. And also really did change the trajectory of what I was going to be doing with my life. And at the time was taking a sports psych class, was doing some research in the kinesiology department, and decided to land in the area of sports psychology with an emphasis on female athletes, disordered eating behavior, eating disorders, and wound up studying for my PhD at the University of North Texas in their counseling psych department with an emphasis in sports psychology. And so through kind of just a happenstance, weird, unique conversation I had in a class kind of shifted my perspective and my focus. And here I am today.
Wow. So Kayla, one of the things that you mentioned that I find astounding and inspiring is that you had a coach and you had athletes that you were working with that were already seeing sports psychologists when you were younger. And I still think it's something we're really struggling to integrate into our sports world, particularly in running and triathlon. And it's really incredible that you were exposed to that so early.
Yeah. Yes, this is my hypothesis. So I grew up in Idaho, which is a very rural area, but where I trained was a small place called Sun Valley. And Sun Valley, again, this is my hypothesis. There's no actual research to support what I'm saying. Sun Valley is a pretty elite area. It's a resort community, lots of wealthy families summer there and vacation there. They have a lot of elite athletes who train there because it's higher altitude. And so there's a lot of wealth and resources coming into that community. And so it's not unusual for them to also be trying kind of the next big thing in health and wellness. There's a lot of people who are seeking out kind of what's going to be the thing that's going to give me the edge over my competition in that community. And so that's where I was training at the time. And so we just kind of had these resources at our fingertips. We didn't just have these resources. Again, it was a very privileged community, and I'm fully aware of that. These resources were there because of the wealth that was in that community. I mean, the majority of athletes, I would say, that didn't have the opportunity to train in that experience and have that exposure did not have access to those resources.
Got it.
Yeah.
Well, it's really incredible that people are out there doing that. And I just hope it keeps happening and more people utilize services that you have to offer.
Oh yeah. There's a huge push for it now. And I think the field is only continuing to grow. And I'm so thankful for programs like mine that are educating young psychologists who have an interest in this field. And all of the professional organizations have put out a call to have professional psychologists or counselors on their staff because there's a need and you can't deny it. And I think that there's kind of a mental health boom happening where people are no longer afraid to talk about the need of mental health. And so with that growth, hopefully comes some really great quality clinicians that can provide needed services.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've noticed this as well in terms of it is becoming more and more talked about, more common for people to just throw out in conversation. I talk to my therapist about XYZ or whatever, which I think is awesome. But I still think that there are some roadblocks, especially for people who feel like, hey, I'm good. Like in terms of my sport performance, I just need to work harder physically and, take care of all these other things. So like what roadblocks do you see to people seeking like sports psychology help or grasping the value of a lot of the tools that are out there for them?
Yeah, a few. So one, just still the continued stigma of mental health, needing mental health services. There still is a barrier there. There are ways that we kind of try to fight against that by just normalizing mental health care. So my being part of the group that we work with together, just normalizing, putting a face to a name, letting me be part of the team, having me come to events, just keeping the presence known. That's one way. So for example, I work in collegiate athletics now, and my office is directly across from the athletic training room. I'm connected to sports medicine. Mental health is just part of their health package here. It's just presented as this is another branch to your health tree. And so again, kind of getting the faces out there, normalizing it, attending games, attending competitions, attending practices. That's one of the ways, because that stigma is still there and we still do fight against that regularly. I think the other piece to it is, unfortunately, mental health services are still a pretty luxurious commodity. They're very expensive and most insurance plans are not covering them. And so you have people who desperately need services. I would argue most people I talk to could benefit from speaking to a therapist. Not that everybody has a diagnosis or needs somebody to help correct anything, but we all benefit from learning how to be more authentic and vulnerable and honest and connected. And in order to do that, insurance isn't going to cover it, and it's going to cost you, upwards of thousands of dollars. That's a huge barrier for a lot of people when that money could go towards so many other essential necessities in life. So that's another barrier. Thankfully, places like collegiate athletics or Atlanta Track Club kind of build those things into their budget, which is helpful. Those are some of the most primary barriers we see. And then there are some communities as well that, these types of problems stay in-house. We don't talk about these issues outside of the home. We don't talk about these issues outside of our circle. And so helping people recognize you are not disrespecting or harming anyone by seeking your own health and wellness and getting help along the way. So having to correct some of those stigmas and misconceptions about mental health services.
Well, it was interesting. One of the stigmas that came up last week while we were doing our presentation was the idea of being tough. Right. What does it mean to be tough? And our athletes, many of them were thinking, okay, if we're tough, then we don't need help. Or if we're tough, we don't need to do this. And that's something that I didn't really realize was such a huge hurdle.
Yeah. One of my favorite authors, and I will watch anything that she ever creates. All of her content is, a bookmark tabbed for me. Anything that is created by Brené Brown and her conversations around vulnerability, right? And how
yes, of course.
There's this common theme of, if I need help or I am vulnerable, I am weak. And weakness and toughness are on opposite ends of the spectrum. And having to have conversations around that's actually not the case. It's actually the strongest, most bravest thing that you can do is to be vulnerable and admit that you need help in a certain area. But yeah, I think we ended that conversation last week with, to talk kindly to yourself is not a weakness. To be tough does not mean you have to be mean. To be tough does not mean you have to be a bully. You can be tough and strong and also incredibly vulnerable. And those things can all exist in the same space. And that equals bravery and having to break down some of those walls for some very deeply held, deep-rooted beliefs around mental health, toughness, vulnerability.
Yeah. I mean, that was just incredible to watch and to hear people, you know, they started talking to each other on the side and like not sure what to do with that information. And it was really great. But, one of the things that I learned about a long time ago when I first started talking to sports psychologists and things is that mental health is a continuum, right?
Yes.
And so we all have mental health. It just depends on where we are on that continuum. And athletes are people first. And if they're people first, then all of those feelings and vulnerabilities and things that we were discussing are true, just like they are for everybody else. But then you add sports to it.
Right. You're a human being first. You just happen to be a human being that runs. You just happen to be a human being that studies chemistry. You just, you're a human being, and human beings have needs, kind of what we talked about in our very first presentation, our hierarchy of needs. Yeah. One of those needs is connection. And in order to connect with people, they do have to know what the true version of you is. And it was interesting, those conversations those athletes were having. I saw some fear creep in of, okay, they're telling me that this is what the research says. And they're saying that if I do this and I engage in this and I allow myself to take this risk here, that risk. It might improve my performance. I don't know how to do that. That's so scary.
Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And 20, 30 years into your life, when you've never done anything different, to take that leap. I mean, I imagine that's terrifying. I do this every day as my living. It doesn't feel so scary to me. So sometimes I present it and I forget that this is actually an incredibly huge leap for individuals. And I have to remind myself, and seeing moments like that really brings me back and reminds me not everybody operates with the same viewpoint as I do. They don't have the same vocabulary. They don't have the same communication style. And it really reminds me, not everybody is at the same level on their readiness and willingness to take those leaps.
Well, it's so true. And as Kacy knows, I'm a huge risk taker across the board all the time. And it does really, I'm like, well, if you're going to get better, why don't you want to do it? And it's true. And all this research is pointing in the direction. So obviously you would do that, even though it's scary. And then to see moments like that is really, I think, helpful and brings so much to light about what it's like in reality when you're not working with this type of thing all day long, like you are, like Kacy is, or like myself.
Right. We really wanted to spend actually a lot of time recapping that presentation because I feel like it was so good. And I think a lot of our listeners would benefit from a lot of the conversations and the things that came up from the athletes. We've kind of touched on this a little bit, but I sort of have two things I want to bring to the table first. One is I think that Brené Brown, so she should be up there with Beyonce of the single word, she should just be Brené.
Yeah.
Right? Yes. Who do I petition to have this happen? Because she is just a goddess of mental health and vulnerability, and it's amazing. Yes. And then the other thing is, so like listening to your presentation last week, I was sitting there and I felt attacked in a very good way, because I was like dealing with a lot of the things that you were talking about. But my favorite thing, and I've been told this so many times, but it always it hits different depending on where you are mentally. Being hard on yourself worked. It would have worked by now. Right. So that was a lot of what we talked about in terms of self-talk and getting people to talk to them positively. And just as we were saying, like, this is a huge leap for people, but how crazy is it that it's a gamble to be nice to yourself?
I know.
Right?
Yeah. I think that's what resonated with me after that conversation was the resistance to wanting to engage in positive self-talk. Yes. And that's why I put up that slide of why are we resisting? Because I could see it in the room. I could feel it in the room. I hear what you're saying, Dr. Balcom. I'm not going to do it, but I hear what you're saying. And just why are we resisting being kind to ourselves? Where did we learn that in order to be the best version of ourselves or succeed, that means we have to be mean to ourselves?
Yes. I know. And that's actually one of the questions I had. Like, what are the roadblocks that these athletes are struggling with, so that they have a hard time making these changes?
Because when we did the exercise where I asked them to say it to each other, they would never say those things to a teammate or a friend or a partner or a loved one or whomever, because we know intuitively, we know as human beings that those hateful words, when said to someone else, are not going to be the thing that motivates that person.
So can you back up for our audience, since they weren't there? All of a sudden, we're having this really incredible, intimate discussion about something we all did together that they don't know about.
Sure.
So can you tell our audience about the exercise? Because that exercise was incredible to watch.
It was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
I loved it. It was one of the most mind-opening things that I think you could have done, and such a great way to break the ice with the athletes. So could you just tell us what it was?
Yeah. So the exercise is a self-talk exercise. And the first thing we have people do is, without a filter, no filter in place, think about a time you've made a mistake. And this can truly be about anything. We were specifically talking about an athletic mistake, but we engage in self-talk all the time. So this can really be about any type of mistake. I forgot to pack extra snacks for my son when he goes to daycare, and now they're calling me because he's hungry and I don't pick him up for 4 hours. It can be a mistake about anything. Write down the first 3 thoughts that come to your mind. The things that you say to yourself without thinking, without your filter, then the first thoughts that come to your mind, write them down on a piece of paper. That's the first part of the exercise, and kind of create your bubble of privacy so you don't feel judged by other people about what you might be writing down, kind of protect your paper so you can really be as colorful as you need to be. And then very brave volunteers, get them to come up in front of the space and have at least 2 people come up to the front of the room, have them face each other, look each other in the eye, and say, the person standing across from you just made a mistake. Go ahead and say to them the things that are written on your paper. And their immediate reaction is, wait, I'm saying this to them? They made a mistake and I'm saying this to them. Yes, you're saying this to them. It's helpful, right? These are the things you say to yourself when you make a mistake.
And oh my gosh, y'all, for you listening, like 50 Shades of Red, both of them, just complete panic.
They didn't want to talk. One of them said, I'm not saying this to her. I would never say this to her. Like as soon as it came out. And the other person, what they had said to themselves, I was so mean. Yeah. They didn't want to say that to the other person either. And so it was very powerful, because in that moment, I think they realized for the first time what they were saying was that negative and hurtful.
Right. Yeah, I think specifically with that second individual, I think there was an element of having to admit openly that this is what they say to themselves when they make a mistake. And just that little light bulb of, oh, if people actually heard the things that I said to myself, they would probably tell me to stop saying that because it's not very nice.
Yeah.
But for all of the people in that room, they have probably been operating for years talking to themselves this way, because you're being tough on yourself, rub some dirt in it, get up, keep going. You need to be your harshest critic. You're going to be the one that gets you to the next level. And for some reason, we have translated all of those messages to, you need to be a bully, you need to be mean to yourself, and you need to treat yourself worse than everybody around you, because everyone around you is just giving you lip service. They're just making you feel better.
That's right. I mean, I used to say those things that I heard come out of the athletes' mouths. I used to say the same things to myself before a race.
Absolutely.
I would say those things to myself. If I didn't run as fast as I wanted to run, if, I had a DNF because of a cardiac issue, and I still talked to myself that way and thought I just hadn't trained hard enough. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, so those are very common things that most athletes, not just in that room, but I think all the athletes that probably are listening or we treat or around say, and just don't realize how it impacts you. So this is probably a good point to jump into, like, what happens when we talk to ourselves this way? Like, how do this negative self-talk impact the athletes physiologically, emotionally, mentally? Like, how does this impact an athlete to speak to yourself this way?
Yeah. So the example I always give people is, imagine that you have someone following you around all day saying those things to you. So take the voice outside of yourself, personify it into another person. That's also a fun experiment, a fun exercise is, if we had to put a face and a name to that voice, do you have an idea where it's coming from? And usually they do. Usually they can identify where those messages began to be internalized. And so pull the voice outside of yourself. Imagine there's someone following you around. So this is another fun one, is following them around on the track and repeating these things to them. But it's me saying, I'm just chasing them around the track. They run much faster than I do, but I'm just chasing them around and I'm saying these hateful things to them.
This is in theory. You don't actually have to chase them.
No. I wouldn't be able to. They would just run really fast and they'd get away from me in a second. But having them realize that when someone else is saying it to them, it feels hurtful, it feels hateful, it feels harmful, because it is all of those things. And over time, the more you hear it, the more depressed we feel, the more anxious we feel, the more pressure we feel to perform a certain way, the more shameful we feel of mistakes. So we feel the need to hide things. We feel the need to create secrecy around parts of our lives. We become more isolated. We disconnect from loved ones because, well, if these are the things that I'm saying to myself, what are other people possibly thinking about me? I can't share this part of my life with these people. And so we see heightened depression, heightened anxiety, heightened performance issues. We see increased illness, sleep issues. I mean, all of the ways that our health can become impacted. Again, right? Mental health is a continuum. So all of the ways that our mental health and our health are connected, if we're talking to ourselves like this constantly, it's literally like we have a bully following us around on a day-to-day basis, talking to us that way, because that's exactly what's happening. We have a bully following us around every single day saying hurtful, hateful things about us.
Well, and I mean, from a physiological level, I like to bring things like this back to a physiological level, because I think as athletes, we're so much more black and white. Yeah. And we can see, like, what happens to our body, we understand. What happens in our head, we sometimes can't relate to.
Yes.
And so if we think about that from physiology, I mean, even if you just bring up the idea of cortisol is the stress hormone, and that elevates when you're talking to yourself that way negatively. And then when we have elevated stress hormone, that causes breakdown in all parts of our body, impacts our sleep, impacts our digestion, impacts everything. So all of it ultimately impacts our performance, not, I mean, putting aside the fact that it impacts our joy of life.
Right. Our ability to connect with others. Why would I want to connect with people if I feel this horribly about myself? And that's a lot. So I tell people working in collegiate athletics, I'm a sports psychologist. I'm a licensed psychologist with a specialization in sport, which gives me the flexibility to talk about anything. Not anything. That's very facetious. There's a broad spectrum of things that I can talk about. And 90% of the work that I do is traditional therapy, because they come in maybe with the idea that they're going to talk about athletics and sports. And I'm struggling with this performance issue. I have the yips over here. I'm not meeting my times over here. And then through continued conversations, opening up space for vulnerability, having someone care about them and not talk to them in the way the voice in their head is talking to them, opens up, okay, this thing is going on in my personal life. I'm really struggling with this relationship. I've had a really difficult time at home. And so 90% of what I do is traditional therapy, in the sense that this voice came from somewhere and you didn't just start talking to yourself this way. We learned this over time and we have grown accustomed to it, where we now think it's normal and helpful. But I would argue it's neither of those things. And we need to create some corrective experiences as quickly as possible.
Yeah. And what I find really interesting, and I'd be really curious to see your perspective on this, but asking people why. Okay. Like, so if we ask ourselves, why do we talk like this to ourselves? Why do we think this is okay? Almost no one has an answer for it.
Right.
I think we know it's not helpful, but again, it's through conditioning. And so why is this the pattern that's most common? And why do we feel like it's so productive when clearly it's harsh?
I think we feel like it's productive because this, and I will only speak to our experiences here in the US, because I haven't worked with athletes overseas. I don't actually know what it looks like in other places. But I think here, athletics is built on the base. If we're creating the pedestal of athletics, the base is toughness. But our message of toughness does not include vulnerability, being kind to yourself. All of our coaches, even from a young age, when we're watching young kids learn how to play sports, when they make mistakes, most often the initial reaction is to get yelled at and be told to do this instead of, hey, okay, instead of doing this, why don't we try this? Let's work on this, and kind of a gentle. So we learn very quickly that, okay, to be successful, to get to the next level, to put myself in this next position, I must push myself. And we have twisted that to pushing myself means I have to be mean. I have to be mean, and I have to be meaner to myself than anybody else could possibly be mean to me. Because if I'm meaner to myself, then what they say won't hurt. So that's the other piece of it is, in my perspective, the other piece of it is, if I'm meaner and harder on myself than anybody else around me, it doesn't hurt so much if someone's disappointed in me or yells at me or is frustrated at me, because I've already said things that are 10 times worse. So that doesn't really sting so much. And so it's kind of a self-protective factor, but it's become maladaptive over time. It's not actually self-protective. It's isolating and keeps us disconnected, because the other interesting thing is all of them are all having this shared experience. We did this exercise. All of them around the table are like, oh gosh, I'm so glad I didn't volunteer. I would never have wanted to say this to the person around me. We're having this shared experience, and yet still a resistance, this feeling of, it's just me though. The stuff that other people wrote down wasn't as bad as what I wrote down probably. And so we still, even in a shared experience, isolate to, it's just me. No one else can understand what I'm going through.
So sad. It's true. And we all do it.
And I do wonder, and I will say that this is purely a wonder of mine. I have absolutely no knowledge, and I've done no research to look into this. I am curious if there's a difference in the way self-talk exists in collectivistic cultures versus individualistic cultures. I'm just curious. I don't actually have any knowledge on that. It would be interesting to see if we could do a study on self-talk. Are there differences in different cultures?
Yeah, that would be very interesting. So we've talked a lot about self-talk, but there are many other things that you work on and that we see in athletes. So what I'm wondering is, what are some other common mental health hurdles that you see runners and athletes struggling with?
Mm-hmm. The most common thing that I see athletes, runners, there are certain sports that certain themes pop up. In running, one of the things that seems to pop up is perfectionism. There's a big experience of perfectionism.
What? No, you're wrong.
No way.
Kacy, that's not true at all, right?
No, no, I'm totally fine making mistakes. Totally fine.
Me too.
Right. Yeah. Your self-talk. What's the self-talk, right? Like, what do we say? And I think that that's the biggest thing is negative self-talk, perfectionism, type A personalities, really controlling, wanting to be. And I also think there's something about individualistic sports too, where I get to be in control of my body and the things that I do. And my performance is purely my responsibility. And I think there's certain sports that really resonate with that, running being one of them.
Hey, Kacy, I think Kayla doesn't know what she's talking about at all. What about you?
Yeah, I totally loved it when I played soccer and I worked so hard and the team still lost.
I mean, I definitely don't think perfectionism and competition and individualism and all that's definitely not something any of us deal with.
No.
I mean, I'm not even type B. I might even be type C.
Yeah, no. You're definitely not type A.
I'm type A plus.
It's so true because you're right. Almost every runner I meet is a type A, except I have to say trail runners tend to kind of not be type A as much. But it's so true. And even in our staff meetings at Precision, I make everyone talk about their mistakes at the end of the staff meeting. And it's awful. Like none of us like to do it. We've gotten better at it. But we decided to do that because it was one of the things that we were all struggling with. And none of us are running competitively. I'm not really able to run anymore, but we're all in that mindset. You're 100% right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Even though those of us in those meetings have this knowledge, right?
It is so much easier for me to talk about my mistakes. I'm always like, well, where should we begin? I've got about a list of 10. And then, before I know it, I've spilled my entire life in the staff meeting.
It's so funny because there's
you do a good job.
I'm a huge Office fan. My husband makes fun of me regularly.
I love The Office.
The best.
So there's an episode, and I'm not a big enough fan to be able to tell you which season.
Oh, I got you,
episode,
Kayla. But I got you. Mm-hmm.
So there's an episode where Michael falls into the pond, right? The koi pond. And Jim says, just make fun of yourself. And then other people around you are going to encourage you and lift you up because they're not going to want you to talk about yourself like that. And so he says, I am a big, dumb dummy. And Michael's like, no, you're not. You're wonderful. And like, oh my gosh, it really works. And it's this idea of what you just said, Kacy. When I'm in this meeting, I have a list of 10 things. Like, okay, here's the list of mistakes I've made. And then people are going to rally behind you and tell you, okay, but you did this and you did this and you did this. And I really thought it was awesome when you did this over here. And it's because of the vulnerability you're expressing. They're not going to pile on you because you are aware of the mistakes that you made. You are owning the mistakes that you made, the areas that you need to work on. You're open to the idea of feedback and instructional criticism and how can I change and improve? And they're not going to pile on you and say, you know what, you're right. Those 10 mistakes are your entire identity and everything else about you is garbage. Like these are the things that we are focusing on because you're already acknowledging them. You are aware that a mistake happened. You're a human being. Of course it happened. We are not perfect beings. And they're going to rally behind you to help you move forward from that. And that's the power of vulnerability, but nobody wants to lean into that because the first thing you have to do to lean into it is acknowledge that you're not a perfect person.
Well, none of us have a problem with that anymore at the office. Kacy is really good at talking about her mistakes. It's true. And we all do. It was, I don't know, how long ago did we start it? Probably a couple of years ago.
We started very soon after I started. So 2019.
Yeah. So we've been trying to do that, but you're right. It's true. And it does bring us all together because you're right. When people are vulnerable, we can rally behind each other and support each other. And it's awesome.
Right. Because you are not alone in the fact that you make mistakes. So if one person acknowledges a mistake, then the next person's okay, well, yeah, I also made a mistake. This is what my mistake was. And it doesn't feel so shameful or embarrassing anymore because, so not everybody around me is perfect all the time. Whew, thank goodness. That kind of lightens the burden a little bit.
Maybe we should do this at the track club.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, let's do that. Hey, Eric. Add it to the list. Amy, add it to the list. Okay, let's go back on here. So one thing I actually wanted to ask you too is, and I don't know if this is true or not, so we kind of asked you what are some of the different things that runners struggle with, but I was wondering if you see the same mental health struggles with both male and female athletes, or if there are typically some differences between the sexes and what they tend to struggle with most.
There are a lot of similarities. One of the differences that I have seen is it seems the stigma around toughness is much more intense with male athletes in the sense of their idea of leaning into vulnerability is very, 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 very difficult. That's not a place that they are willingly gonna go without complete privacy and, an absolute commitment that this information is not going anywhere, because there's something much riskier for them in their minds of taking that step into vulnerability. I did an exercise once with the Georgia Tech football team. It was a fantastic exercise. We had them out with their sleds and the exercise was you need to get from point A to point B, but every 5 yards, we're going to add some plates to your sled. These are life stressors. Every 5 yards, you're going to get an additional life stressor. You just need to get from point A to point B, and you have a team of people and they can help you and they can cheer you on, and you have to get from point A to point B. Nowhere in there did I say you have to get from point A to point B by yourself, but that's all they heard. Every 5 yards, we're adding a plate and I still have to get from point A to point B by myself. They can cheer me on, but I have to do it on my own. Until one group, the other athletes just picked up the plates and walked with them down the field. Awesome. You said that we could help. This is how we decided to help. I'm carrying some of it for you. And then we had a conversation around, this is what vulnerability looks like. You get help in your life by letting people in on what's going on, and they can assist you on your journey. Did any of you in this exercise feel like you were weak or not a good enough football player or not a good enough teammate? And everybody said, well, no, I felt bad because this is a horrible exercise and I wanted to help them. Exactly. Life is a horrible exercise and we need some people to help us sometimes. And there's nothing wrong with it.
I love that. Life is a horrible exercise and we sometimes need help.
All right. So we're going to pull that soundbite out.
But yeah, so that's the primary difference I see with our male and female athletes. But in general, the issues are the same. The issues are the same. And there are some different stigmas that male and female athletes face. And there are some different nuances here and there. I might see more disordered eating behavior amongst our female athletes. I might see some more frightened to take that step into vulnerability with our male athletes. But at the end of the day, when you dig into it and they do take that leap and they do lean in and they are vulnerable, a lot of it is because, I want to be the best and I want people to like me and I'm scared and I feel like an imposter and I don't know how to do this on my own. And, people are people.
Yeah. I think that's the big thing is we don't have to do this on our own. Right. And I know for me in working with a therapist and just various people on my own mental health struggles, that the biggest thing that's helpful for me is the accountability and the direction, because, it's just like anything. You wouldn't just go and start lifting weights willy-nilly, right? Like you would have a plan willy-nilly. And you would have willy-nilly. I know I've used that word a lot lately.
It's one of my favorite phrases. So I'm really glad you did.
Yes, thank you. We would have a plan for all of these other things, right? Or at least someone to help guide us. I find that that's the most helpful thing for me is give me something to do, something to focus on, because if not, I'm going to get caught up in all the other things that are going on, and I'm not going to focus so that I can actually progress and get better and get stronger mentally. And, some people need accountability to lift the weights or to do the workout. I need accountability to be kind to myself.
Sure.
And so it's just all about not doing it on your own. I think I've said this before, but like, it's my biggest thing that I want people to know about seeking mental health services is like, there's so many things you wouldn't do alone. And this is one that you definitely shouldn't do alone.
Yeah. Yeah. And the accountability piece, especially around kind of the self-talk, is just practice saying the things that you're saying inside your head, outside your head. Say it out loud. So your teammates can call you out on it and say, whoa, that was unnecessarily rude. All you need to do is work on this, or, okay, let's shift here, and start practicing saying the things out loud until you are able to recognize, okay, this is actually pretty harmful. Let me adjust how I'm saying it so that it's helpful, not harmful. But you're right. If there's no direction, there's no path, there's no plan. It's like telling one of our Atlanta track club athletes, okay, go run. Okay, well, how far am I running? Where am I running? How long do you need me to run? Nope, just go run. We wouldn't do that, right? We would give them a plan. We would give them a time limit. We would give them a distance, because that's how we operate. And so the same thing applies with mental health. You don't actually want to go into a therapist's office with no goal in mind. You want to have an idea what you're working towards. You want to have an idea, what are you working on? Why are you coming in? And even if that answer is, I don't have anyone else that I can talk to, I just need a space to talk.
So that is actually a really good segue into a topic that I do feel like we need to discuss on this podcast. I read this week in the Fast Women's newsletter that on April 13th, 21-year-old Wisconsin runner Sarah Schultz committed suicide. Her family said that she was overwhelmed by the balance of life, athletics, academics, and everyday life in a single moment. Unfortunately, this is not as uncommon as we would hope. And mental health is a hugely important part of an athlete's life, as we've really been talking about and we know. But what would you say to other athletes out there that might be struggling with this same sort of overwhelm and that might be close to something like this?
Yeah, you're not alone. It's the first thing. You're not alone. There are lots of individuals that are feeling this way. I often tell our student athletes that you are expected to do 2 full-time jobs. You're a student, which is incredibly rigorous and challenging and probably a huge life milestone. You may not have had to work this hard or take this many classes or have this much material. So that's already a full-time job. Okay. But then on top of it, you're going to be an athlete. So that's another full-time job. And that takes up all your time. And you have to travel and you have to miss classes and you don't get to see your family and maybe you live far away from home. And then on top of it, you're in the 18 to 22 age range where all of these life circumstances are happening to you. Maybe you're starting relationships for the first time. Maybe you left home for the first time. You're exploring your own identity for the first time. You're questioning some of the things that you grew up with, and you're learning about different people and different backgrounds and all of these different things all at once. And everybody wants the same demands on your time. And everybody is saying that their demand on your time is the most important demand on your time. So prioritize that one. And so you're essentially juggling 50 glass balls all at once. And if any one of them shatters, you feel like you're facing retribution because everybody has told you that theirs is the biggest priority. My communication to collegiate aged individuals, student athletes, is your health and wellness is actually the first priority. It's the largest priority. It is the most sensitive priority. It's the most fragile priority. Your health and happiness are the most important things. And if there are factors in your life that are not contributing to your health and wellness, we need to explore those things and set some boundaries around them. And their first reaction, well, I can't set boundaries around this because I'm going to get in trouble if I miss this, and I'm going to get in trouble if I miss that, and I'm going to get in trouble if I do this. That's where the vulnerability piece comes in of, okay, so let's have some difficult conversations. Hey, coach, there's a lot of stuff going on in my personal life. I'm really struggling with this. I think maybe I need some help. I need some time. What are my options? Because this sport is also really important to me and I really value it. What are my options? How can we make this work? Hey, professor, I have to travel and we have an exam coming up and my grades are really important to me and I really love the material I'm learning in this class. What are my options here? We have to lean into being open and vulnerable so that people can be aware of what's happening. So people can be aware of all of the glass balls that you're juggling. So maybe someone can say, you know what? This ball of mine that you're juggling is actually a plastic ball. I'd still like you to juggle it, but guess what? If you drop it, it's just going to bounce and it's going to be okay. We'll figure it out later. But we're so frightened to do that because the powers that be have us convinced that we are failing if we don't put their thing first. And the first thing is your health and wellness. Absolutely. Everything else can wait because your health and wellness cannot.
Yeah. One of the things that we were talking about before we started recording was Kacy and I were asking you, is it more common that this is happening now with our athletes and just people in general? Or is this something that's always been happening, but we are more attuned to it?
Probably a little bit of both. I don't want to speak out of turn because I don't specifically know. I do know that college campuses are seeing a rise in suicide. And that's partly because I think our world is much more demanding. I think it's partly because there's, again, these pressures that are being placed on our young age individuals. And then also, I do think there's so much more openness and willingness to talk about mental health. People are less afraid to say, oh, hey, yeah, I'm going to be late to dinner because I'm going to be leaving my therapist's office. So I'll probably roll in, 5 to 10. People are less afraid of saying that because it's so much more normal to take care of yourself and to do so with no shame. There's no shame in doing that. I do know that we are seeing kind of an epidemic of sorts of college age kids dying by suicide. I don't know that anybody has really figured out the very difficult question of why. Why is this happening? What's happening? What's going on? I think culturally, there are a lot of demands. There's a lot of perfectionism. There's a lot of, desire to be the best. And then I also think we're hearing more about it because it's not as hidden in the shadows anymore. I think people are more willing to say, you know what, this person struggled with mental health issues and this is what was going on and these are the demands and this is what was overwhelming to that individual. And we need to talk about it because rather than just saying, rub some dirt on it, keep going, figure it out, suck it up, why don't we change the system instead of expecting the individual to change?
Yeah. You said a lot of very valuable things, but I think just giving someone in that person's life needs to grant them the permission to drop one of the balls, to get help, to do what they need to do to put their health first. And it's so unfathomable for some people to know what that feels like, to be so overwhelmed and so hopeless, essentially, that you consider suicide. You're making a decision there. I think it is more common than any of us really are aware of because it's invisible. There's so many people walking around every day who've been on the cusp of that decision and said no that day. We don't have it on a Post-it note on our forehead as we walk around. Life is hard. It's a bad exercise.
It's bad exercise. There's a phrase. I don't love it. And I'll tell you why I don't love it after the phrase, but there's a phrase that says, suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. I don't love the phrase because it sounds a little flippant, because I think in the moment that person doesn't feel like this is a temporary problem. The person feels like this problem is so overwhelming that this solution is the only one that makes sense. Now, part of why we use that phrasing is because, yes, this solution momentarily for you might make sense, but let me introduce to you all of the other solutions that might make sense. One of them being, let's drop all 50 glass balls. Let's let them shatter. Let's let them break on the floor. You're surrounded by glass. You know what? There are tons of different ways to clean up the mess of those 50 shattered balls. And I think presenting them with some alternatives and also just presenting them with the idea of you are not alone. Even if you feel alone, guess what? Because you've shared this with me, I am one person in your corner that's not going anywhere. you don't have to do this by yourself. Do you want me to reach out to a professor? Do you want me to talk to your coach? At the end of the day, if we drop all 50 glass balls, they all shatter on the ground. There is still a solution out of that mess. And the phrasing, again, I don't love the phrasing. It feels a little dismissive, but the crux of that phrasing is there is another solution. There absolutely is another solution. Maybe you just need another set of eyes to see it.
Right. I mean, it's definitely a true statement in a sense, but there's just a blindness there in that type of desperation that you can't see it. Love the phrasing of just letting every single ball shatter on the floor. And you know what? It's going to be okay.
Yeah.
There's lots of brooms, and I'm sure a lot of people are willing to pick them up.
They'd rather pick up those brooms than the alternative.
That's right. So what are some of the other things that healthcare providers, coaches, teammates can do to help athletes when they're clearly struggling with overwhelm, negative self-talk, and confidence that might eventually lead down a path like this?
I share this story often because it was the first time it was ever asked to me, which seemed strange, but I was in graduate school and I was in supervision with somebody. And before we even started talking about academics or my program or anything, they said, what do you have going on this semester? What's on your plate? I want to have an idea of what's going on in your life so that I know when you might be struggling with something. I know when I can push you a little bit harder, when I need to back off. Just tell me a little bit about what's going on in your world. It's like, what a beautiful question. And why has nobody else asked this question? And it just gave me so much permission to come in at times and say, hey, there's actually something going on this week. I'm probably not going to be as mentally present here because I'm mentally present somewhere else. And it gave me permission to do that because I knew that there wasn't going to be retaliation. And so be curious about the lives of the people in your world. So if you're a coach, be curious about the lives of your athlete. They are not just a commodity for an outcome for you. They are a human being that is participating in a sport, probably because they love it, probably because they're good at it. And being curious about the other elements of their life is going to actually make them a better athlete because they know that they're not just a pawn on a big chessboard for you.
I'm going to use that as a boss because I feel like I definitely ask that in indirect questions all the time. But I think that just leading with what's on your plate right now is a really great specific way to gauge where somebody is, especially when you have a demanding job and there's a lot of things going on. Yeah, that's great.
Because we forget that life stressors are both positive and negative. So someone might be getting married, which is a beautiful and wonderful thing, and also a life stressor.
Oh, yeah.
Somebody might be going through a divorce, which is a life stressor. Somebody might be buying a new house. Life stressors come in positives and negatives, but the stress that it is experienced physiologically is the same. And so asking what's on their plate, not what's overwhelming you, what's stressing you out right now, what's on your plate, all of the things, the good stuff, the bad stuff, and everything in between gives them the opportunity to say, I'm super excited. I'm about to go travel abroad for the first time. Okay, well, there's a lot of stress that comes with that if you've never done it before. So they might be feeling overwhelmed when that trip comes up, but you would have maybe blown past that because, they're just traveling. It's no big deal. And so it gives them permission to own the parts of their lives that have nothing to do with what you are specifically in charge of, but have everything to do with how they might be performing in that area.
Kacy, I don't know about you, but I feel like I've been in therapy for an hour.
I really do. This is, all the feels over here.
This is great. This is really great, Kayla. I can't wait for people to hear this podcast. I mean, I definitely feel like I'm in therapy, but for all the right reasons. And I'm learning so much. And as you know, in our multiple conversations, I feel like I'm pretty aware of this field, but at the same time, I've learned so very much from you.
Well, I am so thankful to be a part of it. I feel the same way about what you guys do. Aside from the part that I actually don't feel knowledgeable in that area at all. So I love listening to you guys because, you do speak about it so simplistically and beautifully of you want to perform to your best. If you're not taking care of your health and your nutrition and your hydration, you're opening yourself up to injury, you're not going to be able to perform at your best. I'm like, well, duh. Why? Like, of course not. And so, I mean, I have loved it. And I love a holistic team. I love a well-rounded team because human beings are holistic. So our care should be holistic as well.
I agree.
Kayla, we always finish our podcast with 3 final questions. They're much easier than they're much easier than anything that we've asked before. This is the easy part. Trust me. This is the wind down from the therapy session. This is the Shavasana of the podcast.
Love it.
Okay. Shavasana of the podcast. I love this. Kacy, every day I love you more. That's amazing.
I have endless wordplay and just witty ideas in my brain. So here we are. So first, our first question is, what is the thing that you regularly do to take care of yourself?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, right now I hang out with my son because he's just so squishy and adorable. Prior to having my son, I watch a lot of garbage TV. I will sit in front of the TV for hours and just watch all the trash television. It's my happy place for sure.
What is trash television to you? That's not
okay.
One of the
See,
questions.
now I don't want to cast any judgment what my version of trash TV is versus what someone else's. Like Selling Sunset, One Tree Hill, Gossip Girl. Yeah, the classics.
Okay, so what is one thing that's bringing you joy right now? I think I know the answer now, but
I feel like my answer to all questions now is my son.
Yeah.
No, you know what? My son, of course, but also my husband and I are transplants to Atlanta. We are not from here. My husband is from Texas. I am from Idaho. We met in Texas. And when we got here was November 2019. And then everything kind of shut down February. And so we really haven't had a chance to explore Atlanta. So something that's really bringing us joy now is as things are starting to get a little bit more open is just kind of exploring this new home that we have. And we're in our second house of living in Atlanta due to some kind of constructional issues of our first home. So we've moved cities already and still haven't really explored Atlanta. And so we're getting the opportunity to find great food and go on awesome hikes and just be outside and really get to know why people love Atlanta so much. So that's been fun.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, that's fun. Okay. Final question, Kayla. Are you ready?
My son. Just kidding.
Okay, this might work. So what is one thing that you love so much you just have to have it? So this can be a food, something you need to do, something you need to be a part of. What's something you just love so much?
My first thought was chocolate, but I'm going to switch it. So I love and miss deeply to my core being near the mountains and the snow. It was just such a huge part of my life, such a huge part of my upbringing. We used to, travel to Yellowstone quite a bit, Jackson Hole, and I miss that so much. And so a deep part of my joy in life comes from being in the snow, being in winter weather, being in the mountains. And I really miss that living in Atlanta. So yeah, I think the snow, I think that I really struggle to live without the snow.
So Kayla, I'm just going to say that's going to fade for sure, because I have lived in Atlanta for over 20 years and I'm from upstate New York. And this year I've spent this year in New York. And it was like negative, I don't know what degrees. And it snowed 2 weeks ago. And I am so over the snow. Like I used to think every time I would come home in December, I'd be like, I love the snow. I can't believe I'm not around it. Oh, forget it. I am so done. I swear to God, you were going to forget it. And I mean, I get the mountains are great.
See, this is what I tell my mom and dad all the time, because my parents want to move out of the winter climate. It's currently still snowing in Idaho. My mom's over it, hates it.
They're smarter than you.
There are only so many pieces of clothing that I can take off when it's hot outside, but I can put on so many pieces of clothing in the cold weather.
No, I still don't agree. I know this is about you and it was your final question, but I just have to say, Kayla, no. I used to use that same argument until this year, but no.
Well, then in that case, South. My son. No.
So yeah, go back to your first answer, your son.
Yeah. So now that we've argued about snow, no, I'm from the South and I am so over needing a jacket. The idea, like if you need to wear 2 jackets, that is too many.
No, you don't. You just need to wear a coat and not a jacket. And maybe like a great scarf and some cute boots.
Oh, Kayla.
I've learned so much in this podcast. And
I think this is going to be a conversation that will resume outside of the podcast for several weeks.
Probably. I love it.
All right. Well, with that, we're going to close it. I am so glad you came on, Kayla.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope that it resonated with you and that you learned something. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps increase our visibility within the platform so that more awesome people like you can find us.
If you'd like to support us further, pretty please, you can visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/morethanmiles. That's www.patreon.com/morethanmiles. Or for a few dollars, you can help the show grow and keep going, as well as receive exclusive perks like monthly Q&As with us. Until next time, remember to run the mile you're in, and that training is so much more than miles.